Pled & Britt helps both large corporations and small businesses with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.
Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. As election days draw nearer, political ads often get meaner. We saw evidence this week that voting is near. We'll be looking at the ads and who's behind them. We'll also examine what the latest polls are showing and the politics of federal judicial appointments. Bill Jefferson was freed this week, just in time to hear that there is a storm heading our way. We'll look at both developments. And with people still searching for answers from the tragedy in Las Vegas, we will examine police procedure for dealing with lone wolf shooters. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources: Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources; Gordon Russell, managing editor for Investigations, the New Orleans Advocate; Kevin Litten, political reporter, NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune; Mike Perlstein, investigative reporter, WWL TV Channel 4. I go over to Gordon first, and former Congressman Bill Jefferson has been released from federal prison.
Yeah, kind of surprising when it happened, but also something we've kind of been waiting for a while, ever since this Supreme Court ruling last year in the case of former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell. And in that case, the Supreme Court sort of narrowed the definition of bribery, essentially narrowed the definition of what constitutes an official act in which a politician might do something in exchange for money. And this was kind of the centerpiece of Bill Jefferson's defense at trial, was that he had never actually done something like passed a bill or taken some real affirmative step to help these people who were giving him money. He did things like sent letters on congressional letterhead. He set up meetings with the Export-Import Bank. He did things like that, but nothing where you could definitively say Bill Jefferson was responsible for doing this favor for these people.
He was convicted of, could you just describe what, briefly remind everybody what he was convicted of?
Yeah, it was a multifaceted case, but broadly speaking, he was convicted of taking money from a couple of different business owners who were seeking business deals in Africa and other places. And he had gotten some money in order to bribe the vice president of Nigeria, among other things, and that was why he was convicted of violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I think he was the first person ever convicted under that law.
And I remember there was a time, the thing that got the most attention was the money in the freezer.
Yeah.
And he was never convicted on that, was he?
Well, he hadn't delivered the bribe, the $90,000 of the $100,000 that the FBI, it was FBI money that was in his freezer because of the whole thing was set up, and the money was still in his freezer. He hadn't delivered the bribe. I'm not sure if we ever learned whether he had just not gotten around to delivering it or whether he was going to keep most of the money for himself.
No, he served 5 years, but the judge who had sentenced him originally came back and threw out a lot of those charges, and that's how he was released.
Correct. There were 10 charges he was convicted on. The judge, the same judge who presided over the trial, threw out 7 of the 10 charges. 3 remaining charges. He had a 13-year sentence originally, and actually one of the 3 remaining charges that he's still convicted of carried a 13-year sentence. So in a sense, it's unclear whether, I mean, the judge ordered him released immediately, and he's out of prison now, but he's due for a resentencing hearing December 1st, and it's possible, theoretically possible, that the judge would decide he still has to serve some more time. Realistically, it doesn't seem like that's what's in the judge's mind, or else why would he have ordered his immediate release?
And that one remaining count for which he could get up to, the 13 years is RICO, racketeering.
Right.
You would think that exposure would be lessened with the vacating of those other convictions that fed into the RICO.
That would be my assumption, is that when they recalculate the guidelines that go into these sentences, when you throw out all these other convictions, then it calls for a reduced sentence on the RICO charge. Because I don't see the judge saying, we'll let him out, and then a month from now saying, oh, he's got to serve 2 more years. That just seems kind of cruel.
So 3 of the convictions remain. Do
Correct.
we see any appeals from either side?
I think
to this?
we don't have a sense yet, but I think it's certainly possible. I mean, I'm sure the government doesn't like the ruling, although it's very much in keeping with what the Supreme Court found, so it's unlikely to succeed. And then I'm sure that Bill Jefferson would love to have those convictions removed from his record, but I'm sure he's also pleased to be out of prison.
Okay. All righty, Gordon. Thanks. Let's move over to Mike now. And everybody is just absolutely stunned and horrified at what happened in Las Vegas this week. And I'm sure every community is stopping thinking, what will we do if it happened here? Are we prepared for something like that here in this region?
Yeah, and that tends to be the nature of these mass shootings. They're all different as far as motive, how they're carried out, but each time law enforcement and communities have to look at what sort of steps they can take to prevent something happening in their community. Now, in this case, it was a music festival outside of a hotel room, 32nd floor perch, in which this lone gunman was able to open fire with just a literal arsenal of weapons. New Orleans is the type of place that has major gatherings. Think about the crowds at Jazz Festival. If looked at from a high enough perch, those are basically defenseless, targets. And you better believe that law enforcement, federal as well as state and local, are going to be, looking at the security measures as they do anyway, but now they have to plan and train for, this possibility. Now, Mardi Gras is another classic example.
Right. Huge crowds on
tens of
Canal Street.
thousands, and over the course of the Mardi Gras weekend, hundreds of thousands gather in pretty tight quarters, all of which can be seen from high perches from hotel rooms. So we have, of course, in the aftermath of this shooting, seen all kinds of talk about whether people entering and exiting hotels should go through some sort of screening. I think that that's probably a long shot, but you certainly will have, on the local level, New Orleans police SWAT team, as they do often with tabletop exercises. Yeah. This is just yet another scenario that they have to add to their conversation. And, it's unfortunate with so many mass shootings. The SWAT team is trained in a couple of different ways. Now, one is a situation where someone's barricaded inside of a house, armed, maybe they have fired shots, but their mission is to defuse the situation and send in, a hostage negotiator or talk somebody off the ledge. But then you have the active shooter, in which there isn't the time, opportunity, and that more harm could be done. So in those cases, there's a whole different type of training in which SWAT officers are trained basically to hit with speed, surprise, and overwhelming force to neutralize the threat, even if it means ultimately killing the perpetrator.
Right. Well, it was just, Errol, go ahead.
But Mark, we did have an incident in February of '73 where somebody was on the high floor, and that was the Howard Johnson sniper incident. Mark Essex was on the 18th floor. So, there's a lot of differences, but it was still a sniper shooting. There wasn't a big event, but he was shooting at people miscellaneous. And at that time, the concept of SWAT teams hadn't been created yet. And so the police responded. They really didn't know how to deal with those kind of things.
Oh, yeah.
But one thing that came to mind was watching the coverage last week, is the early indications that this must be several people that are doing this. And that was the same thing that was said during the Howard Johnson thing. And I think what it is when somebody's firing at random, you start getting all these ricochet shots, and people think that it's a bigger scene than it really is.
Well, in this case, so many shots were fired in such a short period of time that even now law enforcement is looking at the possibility of a second shooter. Turns out that this gentleman had taken semi-automatic assault rifles, added what they call a bump stock to turn them into basically machine guns, in which all you have to do is squeeze the trigger once and it will fire continuously, so you can literally get dozens of shots per second. That is not something that they had to deal with in the Howard Johnson, sniper attack with Mark Essex. As you recall, though, that was certainly the New Orleans Police Department making up as they went along, they eventually were able to get in a helicopter and fly over the rooftop of the Howard Johnsons, and that was where they eventually shot and killed the suspect in that case. But there was still, even after that, a search through that whole building, and then later, I guess you could call it urban myth or conspiracy theories, that there must have been some second gunman, simply because the carnage was so great to come from a single shooter.
So here, though, we should feel that NOPD is training and planning for, God forbid, an incident.
One of the real bright spots of the NOPD is the SWAT team. There are federal standards for the training that they undergo. Fortunately, they are deployed infrequently, but when they are incredibly organized. There's a real esprit de corps, unlike maybe some of the graveyard shift beat patrols in a district. These guys are all members of tactical and special operations. They take the high risk assignments. They're on violent offender warrant squad. They break down doors, and so I guess you would call them the proactive cops who trained for this, and when it is time to ring the bell, they spring into action highly prepared. Full gear, bulletproof vests, and they have the kind of weapons to pretty much match anything short of a machine gun, which is now a whole new conversation. That's something we have not seen, and hopefully
never will.
We'll never see that again outside of wartime conditions.
Right. All right, Mike, thanks. Let's go on over to Gordon again. And, we are, of course, now in the final days of this elections, of course, the mayor's race in New Orleans, and the Advocate and WWL released some poll results this week. So what did y'all find? Let's go first to the mayor's race in terms of who's standing where.
So our poll found, very close. It's very close between the top three candidates: Desiree Charbonnet, LaToya Cantrell, and Michael Bagnaris. Really, the other candidates aren't seen to be much of a factor here. And Charbonnet and Cantrell are sort of neck and neck. With our poll found Cantrell with 27, Charbonnet with 26, and Bagnaris with 19. Given the poll's margin of error, that still puts Bagnaris theoretically within striking distance. I would say, and there's an 18% were undecided, which is a big number this late in the game. So it's really kind of a toss-up. One of the more interesting things I thought was there's sort of often elections in New Orleans tend to be very racially polarized, and there wasn't a clear racial pattern in this one. For instance, if you look at the numbers, among white voters, Charbonnet had 22%, Cantrell 23%, Bagnaris 24%. Among black voters, Charbonnet 28%, Cantrell 30%, Bagnaris 15%. So I guess it showed a little, among black voters, it showed that Cantrell and Charbonnet were the favorites, and that would suggest that they have the best shot of being in the runoff, I think. But it's a less racially polarized field than you normally would see in New Orleans.
And what other areas did you poll?
Well, we polled a number of other things. Another interesting race I wanted to mention was the coroner's race, which theoretically isn't a race at all. You've got two candidates, one of whom, the incumbent, Jeff Rouse, has dropped out, but he couldn't get his name off the ballot in time, and so he's asked people to vote for his opponent, Dwight McKenna. Our poll found McKenna at 36% and Rouse at 30%, which is neck and neck considering those factors, and it may have something to do with the fact some people may not know about this decision by Rouse to drop out. There may be a sour taste in some voters' mouths by the way that Rouse dropped out. It was sort of odd timing after qualifying had already passed when it was too late for someone else to run. Dr. McKenna has a federal tax conviction in his past from when he was on the school board, and that may be something people aren't crazy about either.
And some people hoping that by Rouse winning, in effect, he can resign and there can be a special election.
If Rouse were to win, there would be another election, assuming Rouse could, I guess, theoretically, he could decide he wants to be coroner after all, but I think that's unlikely, and he would resign. And
if he did, that'd be the strangest campaign ever.
It would be.
To run by saying you resign and then to win.
That would be very strange. But I suppose
the fact that he's at 30%, and McKenna, who's run many times before, never really even came close. Clearly not. Going in with the big mandate.
Yeah, well, McKenna hasn't really been campaigning either, and he's refused to talk to our reporters. I don't know if you guys have had any luck, but he's running a very sort of subterranean kind of campaign as well. So that's a strange race.
And then quickly, if you can touch on the results for Cannizzaro and also the police chief.
Right. So we polled approval ratings for several local officials. The police chief, Mike Harrison, came in at 60% approval rating, which was relatively high, especially considering there's a lot of dissatisfaction about crime. Mitch Landrieu, 57%. Cedric Richmond, the congressman, 59%. And Leon Cannizzaro, the DA, at 46%.
Okay. All right, a week to go, right? And early voting is continuing tomorrow, and we believe that most of the polling places are going to be open tomorrow. But the negative campaigning, the negative ads, they're definitely before us now. So what are we seeing?
They are, and I think the interesting thing about some of these negative campaigns, when we were last here and talking about, there was one PAC that was out there doing a lot of campaigning against Desiree Charbonnet, and now we have a second PAC that's been in play, and it's really, the way I've seen it, is kind of been a campaign about personalities, but it's not about personalities that are actually in the race. The PAC that we first saw emerge is bringing up the politicians of the past, these personalities of the past. They brought up Ray Nagin, they brought up Bill Jefferson, and really tried to tie a candidate who really doesn't have a lot in her past to these kind of undesirable politicians. And then you've got another personality, Sidney Torres, who's really trying to influence the race with his PAC, initially saying, I'm not going to support a candidate, but then he holds this debate, which Desiree Charbonnet decides not to come to, and he uses this to just launch an incredible assault on the airwaves through a series of ads that many of them are echoing the anti-Desiree PAC that's funded by who we now know is a group of business leaders.
And so who are these business leaders? What do we find out?
So one of the people that's funding it, one of the top funders, is Leslie Jacobs, who many people know from her education reform efforts. She's also a mayoral candidate, former school board candidate. One of the ones that I thought was really interesting that's on there is Jay LaPierre. And the reason I found him interesting as being involved in donating to that PAC is that he also crossed over and donated to Michael Bagnaris. One thing to keep in mind about Jay LaPierre is that he has a past president of LABI, and he's also still on the board on the executive committee of LABI. So LABI's interest in this race would really be around issues like equal pay, minimum wage. So I think there's questions now that you see some of these business leaders getting involved about whether or not they're trying to send a signal to voters that, if you are kind of a pro-business voter, that you may want to look at a candidate like Michael Bagnaris. Troy Henry is kind of your distant fourth, and he's mostly being supported by a PAC. His campaign fund has like $16,000 in it, and the ads have all been funded by the PAC. And then at the last, and those were very pro-business interests. Now at the last debate, he was the only one on the stage who did not support minimum wage, said it was only supported for City Hall. So you do start to see these little kind of indicators about where the business community is lining up.
Now Sidney Torres is an interesting case. Obviously, he held this forum. Desiree Charbonnet was a no-show, and he has now tailored television ads based on the fact that she didn't appear. However, what if she had appeared? Would Sidney Torres still be, launching this attack? It does sort of make you wonder if maybe there was, something in his strategy all along to go after this candidate, whether she showed up or not. It's hard to believe that just, and she, gave a reason for not appearing, that alone would be a reason to spend so much money in attack with, really a vicious TV campaign.
And it really all seems partly designed to promote his own personality, as he had sort of an infomercial in the middle of the debate as well, talking about his own decision, wrestling with whether to run for mayor or not. And so all of this would seem to sort of be positioning himself down the road.
So I don't know about you, I didn't see any policy, I didn't see any taking a stand on an issue that's dividing him and...
Not to mention that his reality show is filming currently, and the Charbonnet campaign has just, filed a letter which they CC'd the FCC on, accusing him of using electioneering.
So how is the Charbonnet campaign, what are they doing to answer all of these negative ads from these two PACs?
Well, they're really kind of fighting a war on two fronts that doesn't include any of their opposition candidates. They've cut an ad to respond to the not-for-sale NOLA packs, in essence saying, this is old school politics, don't pay any attention to it. And I think they needed to do that because I think the candidate needed to come out and be on camera. And she even held up a mailer that had gone out. So a very direct attack there. And then I think they're sort of doing it through surrogates with Sidney Torres and trying to question, well, did he donated to Ray Nagin? What's everybody's bringing up Ray Nagin. Here's a guy who donated to Nagin, benefited from contracts under Nagin. So they're really trying to undercut Sidney Torres. But, in both ways, the way that they're answering these attacks are the ways that they would have done it against a campaign, except the campaigns just aren't active there. They don't need to be.
So a week ahead, still more attack ads before us, you believe? They're going to continue?
I think the attacks are going to continue, and I wouldn't be surprised to see some of the candidates starting to go after each other. I mean, Michael Bagneris, according to the Advocate poll, if Troy Henry wasn't in that race, I think that Bagneris would probably benefit from some of Troy Henry's voters. You've seen them go at it a little bit. Does Bagneris and LaToya start going at it a little bit because they may be fighting for that last runoff spot? So we may see a little bit of that next week.
Okay. All right. While we do this show, we are facing a hurricane, Errol. Hurricane Nate. Right now, tropical storm, going to be a hurricane, and they say we're going to be receiving impacts from it.
A couple of points. You're just watching the coverage. First of all, I'm thinking about the geographic language of hurricanes. If somebody is new to this area, and they're watching the coverage and they're hearing that the tropical storm is going to hit Plaquemines Parish, and they think, gee, that's right across. That's right across the river right there, Belle Chase and all that. That's Plaquemines Parish. And not realize that they're talking about the tip of Plaquemines Parish, which is like 100 miles away, that it's a whole different thing. Or if they hear that it's going to hit Jefferson Parish, and they're talking about Grand Isle, and if in their mind they're thinking about Metairie, it's two different things, all right? And then the other thing, if they hear all this alarm about storm surges, which is serious, but if you live in Gentilly, or if you live in Bywater, you don't have to worry about storm surges. And so you almost need some sort of a guide to understand the sort of things that they're talking about. But one thing I'm thinking about is that this hurricane being in October reminds me, and there have been several October hurricanes, but one that came to mind was Hurricane Opal, which hit in 1995, which had an almost exact similar track. It started off in Central America. It came up. It was a little bit further from Louisiana than this is, but it cut across that same way, across Plaquemines and St. Bernard, and then into the Gulf Coast, went up around Pensacola, and then into the Tennessee Valley, almost the same sort of track. And a lot of, I think, New Orleanians were aware of this because this is when people were starting to discover places like Destin and Sandestin. A lot of New Orleanians, were investing in vacationing. And that was the first major hurricane that hit that area and that really tested that area. And most of those places stood up pretty well, that they were built with hurricanes in mind. But it just reminded me, I was amazed when I saw Opal's track with this, and they were both October hurricanes. And the other thing about Opal is that it was the same week that the verdict came down on the O.J. Simpson trial. So it was O.J. and Opal in October. So it was a big event.
Okay, well, Nate is not a welcome visitor in October. We just assumed that he wasn't around, but I guess we're going to have to deal with it to some degree this weekend. All right, let's go on over to Gordon right now. And we heard this week that a local attorney who was being considered he was nominated by Senator Kennedy for U.S. attorney is not going to get it.
Yeah, Kyle Shonicus had been John Kennedy's pick for U.S. attorney in New Orleans, and he's been notified by the White House that he's no longer, they're going to go in a different direction. It's not clear what happened here. This is sort of after he had a background check by the FBI. It's possible something came up in that. It's possible that they didn't like the fact he was a surprise pick and that he was instrumental in causing a big change in leadership over at the U.S. Attorney's Office by exposing some misconduct in the office a few years ago. So it was sort of some people saw it as a slap in the face to make him the U.S. Attorney. It's also possible that his representation or his firm's representation of some controversial clients like Black Lives Matter and Planned Parenthood may have soured the White House on him. But anyway, that means we're still without a U.S. attorney for the foreseeable future. President Trump fired all the U.S. attorneys back in March, so it's been 7 months, but they've been slow to fill a lot of these jobs. There's a number of people whose names have been mentioned in conjunction with this, but Senator Kennedy hasn't given an indication of which direction he's going to go yet.
Yeah, a lot of those names had been floating around, at the time Shonicus was also floating around. Those names then kind of went to the sidelines, so it'll be interesting to see if there's maybe some new name that we haven't heard yet pop up.
Right. I mean, I'm not sure that that some of those people I think were campaigning for the job, whereas I'm not sure that Kyle Shonicus was. But in any event, so it'll be interesting to see if one of those people is picked or somebody else.
And then also about federal judgeships.
Right. So the Trump administration has moved on. There's a number of local federal judgeships that are open. He recently nominated Kurt Engelhardt, who's on the local federal bench, to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal bench, so sort of a promotion for Kurt Engelhardt, assuming he gets it. And then he's nominated lawyer Kyle Duncan, who's kind of a noted conservative warrior, represented Hobby Lobby, and he's done some of these big abortion cases. He's also been nominated for the Fifth Circuit. And then for the local bench, he has nominated Barry Ashe, a lawyer with Stone Pigman, and we're expecting that Wendy Vitter, former Senator David Vitter's wife, is going to be nominated. That hasn't actually happened yet. And then there will be one more opening caused by the promotion of Engelhardt to the appeals court. So we don't know. A couple names that have been mentioned for that are Jay Wilkinson, a magistrate judge, and Tommy Flanagan, a local lawyer with his own firm.
In all these cases, it's most common the United States senators who are advancing these.
Correct. And they usually sort of divide them up, and then they sort of each have veto power over nominees.
Okay, so this is all a process and it takes a while.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right, time to look ahead. Errol.
Well, with the election coming up way down at the bottom of the ballots, down to everything else there, also just about every parish is going to have some millage renewals and some special district funding referendums. Usually there's no campaigning on this because the political people figure, look, if you don't raise a ruckus, people will vote and they'll get by on their own. But just be sure you look down at the bottom of the ballot when you go and vote.
Okay, Gordon?
Well, I'm going to predict that Nate is not going to do us any real damage, and I'm also going to predict that we will have an all-female runoff in the mayor's race.
All right, we'll see. Kevin?
I think everybody's familiar with the Alliance for Good Government. There's also one called the Coalition for Good Government. These little groups kind of like to do things during election time, but they will be in court on Wednesday fighting a trademark situation where the Alliance is saying Coalition for Good Government is trying to trick everybody into thinking they're the Alliance.
Okay.
Should be an interesting case.
All right, Mike.
Now, Gordon's over here predicting not very much damage from Nate, which should become Hurricane Nate, but it is going to be a test of the Sewage and Water Board. And we've seen with July 22nd and August 5th, just a rainstorm caused street flooding, businesses and some homes. They've been scrambling to put their system back together. This is the first real test of this interim management team. My team at WWL is doing a deep look called Down the Drain, so you want to keep a close eye on just how this storm is handled.
All right. Thanks, guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us. Do stay safe this weekend. We'll see you again next Friday for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.
Businesses with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.